He should have been dead by sunrise. The rising sun, that red circle emblazoned on his wings, on his forehead, on the very flag of his empire, was meant to be the last thing he ever saw. But on the morning of April 12, 1945, Petty Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa of the 201st Air Group was still alive. His Zero cut through the dawn air above Okinawa, its engine trembling from overuse, the sea beneath a mirror of molten gold. He could see the American fleet ahead, an iron horizon. Every ship glinted like a blade. Below, tracer fire stitched the ocean. The air shook with flak. He was supposed to dive now, to crash into one of those carriers, to become fire and memory. Instead, something happened that no one in his squadron, not his comrades, not his commanders, nor could explain. Ogawa hesitated. In the cockpit, the rising sun flag fluttered from the instrument panel. His gloves were slick with sweat. The photograph of his family, his mother, his younger sister, taken in Kagoshima, trembled under the airflow. He whispered the words drilled into him for months. For the Emperor. For Japan. His thumb hovered over the trigger that would lock his course into eternity, but he couldn't press it. The sky above him roared, and for one impossible moment the Zero climbed instead of diving. When he landed 2 hours later, alive, unscathed, disoriented, his superiors said nothing. They stared at him in disbelief, their silence heavier than any reprimand. A kamikaze pilot who failed to die was not a soldier. He was an anomaly, a ghost caught between worlds. In his quarters that night, Ogawa wrote a final note. Not an apology, not a plea, but a confession. One that would remain sealed in an envelope marked to be opened after victory. It would not be opened until 1952, when Japan was already rebuilding, when investigators searching through military archives discovered it among the ashes of a burned airfield. Inside, in delicate brushstrokes, were just 9 words. The gods did not want me to die today. That note would send shockwaves through Japan's post-war intelligence and religious circles, and change how the world saw the mind of the kamikaze forever. Autumn 1944, Japan was cornered. The empire that once stretched from the Aleutians to New Guinea was collapsing under the weight of American steel. The skies over the Philippines burned day and night, filled with the droning of B-29s. Every island that fell brought the enemy closer to the homeland. The Imperial Navy was broken, its carriers gone, its battleships bleeding fuel. And yet, at Atsugi, Chiran, and Kanoya air bases, something new was stirring, a force born of desperation and faith. They called it Tokotai, the Special Attack Units, but the world would come to know it by another name, Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. The first volunteers gathered in the dying light of October 1944. Young men, some barely 19, stood before portraits of the Emperor and bowed low. Their instructors told them this was not death but transcendence. "You will not die," one officer said. "You will become the wind that saves Japan." They wrote farewell letters, posed for photographs, and practiced smiling for the camera, the last image their mothers would ever see. Among them was Kiyoshi Ogawa, 21 years old, tall, quiet, and from a family of schoolteachers in Kagoshima Prefecture. He had been studying engineering at Waseda University before being drafted into the Navy in 1943. His instructors described him as disciplined but distant, a man who listened more than he spoke. When the call came for volunteers for the new Special Attack Corps, Ogawa hesitated only once. "If my death can protect my country," he told his superior, "then my life is already given." But those words were not born of zeal. They were born of exhaustion. The war had taken everything, and food, sleep, even meaning. Japan's newspapers printed victories that no longer existed, and the people clung to illusion because the truth was unbearable. At the airfield, Ogawa saw boys who prayed before takeoff with trembling hands. Some laughed too loudly, some wept in secret, and some wrote their farewell letters twice, once for their families, and once for themselves. In the evenings, when the base went quiet, Ogawa would sit by the runway and look toward the sea. He once told his mechanic, "The ocean looks peaceful because it doesn't know what's coming." The 201st Air Group had been stationed at Kanoya, on the southern tip of Kyushu. Their mission was clear: intercept the American invasion fleet approaching the Philippines. The first attack, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, would make history. On October 25, 1944, Seki and his men struck the escort carrier USS St. Lo, sinking it in a ball of fire. It was the first successful kamikaze strike in history. Tokyo radio broadcast it as divine proof of Japan's destiny. The word kamikaze swept across the nation like wildfire. Posters showed smiling pilots beneath cherry blossoms. Children sang songs about the brave souls who became the wind. But inside the 201st Group, the truth was darker. For every successful hit, 10 planes vanished into the sea before reaching their targets. The Americans had learned to scatter their fleets, to build walls of flak so dense they turned the sky into steel. The suicide missions became less divine and more desperate. By November, Ogawa's unit had lost more than half its men. Replacement pilots arrived almost daily, boys who had barely finished flight school. Some could hardly land without crashing. Their instructors stopped teaching maneuvers. They only taught how to dive. Each morning before dawn, the pilots assembled in front of the shrine near the airstrip. They tied white hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, the red sun painted at the center. They bowed toward the east, chanting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," long live the emperor. The ground crew lined up beside them, heads lowered. Then the flight leader would shout the mission's name, Operation Kikusui, Chrysanthemum Waterfall. The men would climb into their planes one by one. No one looked back. Ogawa watched them leave. He was assigned to the maintenance detachment that month, waiting for his turn to fly. He polished his aircraft daily, checked the fuel lines, oiled the propeller. The Zero's fuselage was old, patched from spare parts. The mechanics joked that it was more ghost than machine.
"Fitting," Ogawa replied quietly.
So am I. At night, the barracks filled with the sound of music. Someone played a shamisen. Another recited poetry from the Kojiki. The officers allowed sake rations on the eve of missions, to calm the spirit. But there was no joy in their laughter. It was the laughter of men who had already said goodbye to the world. In late March 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa began, the 201st Air Group was ordered south. They would be Japan's final shield, the last hope to stop the American fleet from reaching the mainland. Over 1,900 kamikaze pilots were stationed across Kyushu. Every day, dozens took off and never returned. The air smelled of burnt fuel and cherry blossoms. Spring had come again. Beautiful, cruel, indifferent. When Ogawa's name was finally called, he bowed deeply before his commander. He spent the night writing letters. One for his mother, thanking her for raising him. One for his sister, urging her to live happily. And one more, sealed, unsigned, that would not be found until 7 years after the war. At dawn, he put on his flight suit, tied his white scarf, and stepped onto the tarmac. His plane was armed with a single 250-kilogram bomb fixed beneath the fuselage. The mechanic bowed before him and said, "Please make a beautiful death, sir." Ogawa smiled faintly. "I'll do my best." He climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his goggles, and started the engine. The propeller coughed, then caught. The rising sun flag rippled on the wing. He saluted once toward the control tower and took off into the morning sky. The engines screamed against the dawn as Kiyoshi Ogawa's Zero clawed through the air over Kyushu. The fuel gauge trembled at half. The radio crackled with static, brief clipped voices of his squadron fading into the wind. "Tora, Tora, we see the fleet. May we meet again at Yasukuni." Then silence. Only the howl of the wind against metal remained. Beneath him, the sea burned silver under the rising sun. The American fleet stretched across the horizon like a moving island, destroyers fanning out in rings, battleships spewing black smoke, and at the center, the unmistakable flat decks of carriers. He could see their shadows shifting through the haze. Essex, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, Intrepid, floating fortresses ringed by escort fire. Ogawa's orders were clear. Dive at a carrier, aim for the flight deck's midsection, and crash. No egress, no return. He glanced at the photograph of his mother taped near the altimeter. Beneath it, a tiny charm, a omamori from the Tenmangu shrine in Dazaifu, swung with each vibration of the fuselage. She had given it to him the day he left home. "So you won't get lost," she'd said, smiling as if the word war were still just something printed in newspapers. But now, as Ogawa banked east, that charm seemed to pull against the air, as though begging him to turn back. His target came into view. A column of smoke rose from the sea where another kamikaze had struck moments before. Over the radio, someone shouted, "Direct hit on destroyer!" "Banzai!" Then an explosion so loud it cut the signal. His hands trembled on the stick. He pushed the throttle forward, the engine's whine turning into a roar. His cockpit filled with vibration. The altimeter needle spun downward, 9,000 feet, 7,005. Flak erupted around him. The sky was a storm of black puffs and streaking light. Metal shards clanged against his fuselage. A burst tore through his right wingtip. Another grazed the canopy. Ogawa's body jolted as the Zero shuddered. The world turned red and white. He blinked, struggling to focus. His vision tunneled. He was supposed to lock in his dive angle now. 30 degrees, steep enough to penetrate armor, shallow enough to strike midship. The nose dipped. The sea rushed upward. He could see the men on deck. Small figures running, pointing, guns flashing. He could even make out the white stars on the American planes below. But then in the chaos, something happened that no training, no ritual, no indoctrination could explain. His hand froze. The control stick trembled in his grip. The smell of oil and burning rubber filled the cockpit. His heart pounded like a drum. His finger hovered over the arming switch, but he couldn't move it. He thought of his mother again. Her hands wringing a towel, her hair pinned in that neat bun, her voice telling him to be careful. He remembered his sister's laugh, the sound of rain on the tile roof, the way the wind smelled of earth and sea back home. The words from the Kokutai manual echoed in his mind. A pilot must abandon self, time, and body. There is only the Emperor, but Ogawa was still there, still human, still terrified. At the last moment, and when he was less than a mile above the waves, he pulled back. The Zero lurched upward, wings screaming, smoke trailing behind. Anti-aircraft bursts ripped through the sky around him. One exploded near the left aileron. The force slammed him sideways, his head smashing against the canopy. He tasted blood. The aircraft spun, one full roll, two second before he regained control. When he leveled out, the fleet was already behind him. He had survived. He did not shout. He did not cry. He only breathed, shallow, trembling, alive. The sound of the engine filled the silence inside him. He didn't know where to go. Fuel was nearly gone, the compass broken. The only thing visible was ocean, endless, gleaming, indifferent. He flew north, guessing. The wind pressed against the canopy, whispering. He began to recite softly to himself. Not a prayer, not an anthem, but a poem he'd learned as a child. Though the cherry blossom falls, its fragrance remains upon the wind. Hours passed. The sun rose high. Then through the shimmering horizon he saw the dark outline of land. Kyushu. Home. He landed at an auxiliary strip near Miyazaki. The landing gear barely held. The left tire burst on impact. The plane skidded, nose dipping, wings folding under strain. When the dust cleared, he sat in silence, hands locked on the stick. He expected military police to appear, rifles raised. Instead, there was nothing but the hum of cicadas. When ground personnel finally arrived, they stared as if seeing a ghost. No one spoke as they helped him out of the cockpit. A sergeant approached, eyes narrow. "Where is your target?" Ogawa saluted weakly. "I failed." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "You missed?" He nodded. The man didn't respond. He turned away, muttering something under his breath. "Kami no seida." It was the god's will. Ogawa was confined to a barracks that evening. No formal interrogation, no charges, just silence. The kind of silence that spoke of disbelief and fear. That night, as the others slept, he sat at his desk, staring at the small lamp flickering beside his helmet. He could still hear the sound of the wind screaming through the holes in his fuselage. He could still feel the tremor in his hands. He opened his notebook, the one where he'd written his farewell letter the night before, and turned to a blank page. The ink bled slightly as he began to write. "I saw the fleet. I saw their faces. They were boys like us. I thought of my mother and I could not die." He paused. The paper shook under his hand. Perhaps the gods refused me. Perhaps they wanted one of us to live, to tell them that death is not honor, only silence. He tore out the page and folded it carefully. Then he wrote the final message that investigators would find years later. "The gods did not want me to die today." He sealed it, labeled it, and placed it beneath his uniform cap. Then he lay down, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. The next morning, the squadron commander summoned him. The man was older, severe, with a scar running from temple to chin. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "Ogawa," he said, "you understand what you've done?" "Yes, sir." "You were given the Emperor's mission." "You lived?" "Yes, sir." The commander studied him. "Did you turn back willingly?" Ogawa hesitated. "I don't know. I think something took control of my hands." The commander's brow furrowed. "The spirit of the wind, perhaps." Silence. Then quietly, "You will not fly again." Ogawa bowed. "Yes, sir." He was reassigned to ground duty, refueling, loading bombs, repairing planes. Day after day, he watched new volunteers arrive, smiling, waving, disappearing into the clouds. None returned. He became invisible, and yet, every time he looked up at the sky, he felt it again. That same pull, that same invisible thread that had turned his plane upward instead of down. He began to wonder, was it weakness or mercy? The rain began 2 days after Ogawa's return. It fell in thin, whispering sheets that turned the Kanoya airfield into a mirror of mud and reflection. The air smelled of fuel and wet iron. To the men of the 201st Air Group, the downpour was a blessing. It delayed flight operations, gave them time to eat, to sleep, to pretend that tomorrow was not another suicide order waiting to be signed. Ogawa stood at the edge of the runway, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. The wreck of his Zero had already been hauled away, its remains stripped for spare parts. The mechanics joked that its engine would fly again in another man's death. He didn't answer. Inside the base headquarters, rumors spread faster than the rain. A Toko pilot had returned alive. The officers denied it, of course. The very idea was impossible, an insult to the purity of the mission. But by evening, whispers reached even the kitchen staff. He came back, they said. The wind refused him. In wartime Japan, such stories were dangerous. Faith was the engine that kept the empire running. Doubt was sabotage. So when Ogawa was summoned to the command hut the next morning, he walked as though stepping into his own execution. 3 officers awaited him. Commander Fujita, head of the 201st, Lieutenant Matsuo, his intelligence adjutant, and a naval chaplain, his white robe spotted with rain. They made him stand in silence for nearly 5 minutes before Fujita spoke. "You were assigned to Operation Kikusui Sango," he began. "Your flight number was 4. "Yes, sir." "Your wingman, Petty Officer Hara, crashed into an enemy destroyer. His death has been confirmed?" "The others," Fujita's eyes flicked down to the papers on his desk. "Did not return?" "Yes, sir." The commander's gaze lifted. "And yet you are here." Ogawa swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Fujita's voice was measured, but beneath it was steel. "Explain." Ogawa stared at the floorboards. "My instruments failed. I lost visibility in cloud cover. I became disoriented." "A lie." Ogawa looked up. "Sir?" Fujita's hand struck the desk. "Do not insult the Emperor with cowardice disguised as weather." The chaplain stepped forward, calm, his voice almost gentle. "Petty officer, it is not shame to admit weakness. The path to redemption is sincerity." Ogawa's throat tightened. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room. He took a breath. "I saw the fleet. I began my dive, but something stopped me. I don't know what." Lieutenant Matsuo scribbled notes with sharp, deliberate movements. "Stopped you?" He repeated. "You mean of fear?" Ogawa shook his head. "No, it wasn't fear. It was something larger. It felt as if the plane itself resisted me. As if my hands were no longer my own." The room fell silent. The chaplain tilted his head. "The wind?" Ogawa hesitated. "Maybe, or the gods. I don't know." Commander Fujita exhaled slowly, then turned to Matsuo. "Strike this from the record," he said. "No such report exists." "Yes, sir." Fujita leaned forward, eyes burning. "Petty Officer Ogawa, you will speak of this to no one. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You are confined to quarters until further orders." Ogawa bowed. "Yes, sir." As he left, Fujita's final words followed him out the door. "The divine wind does not fail, Petty Officer. Only men do." In the weeks that followed, Ogawa lived like a shadow. He slept in the far corner of the barracks, ate in silence, worked without complaint. Every day, new kamikaze flights left the runway, and every day fewer men returned to dinner. He saw boys no older than 16 write their farewell poems, smiling through tears. He watched ground crew polish planes that would never land again. The base was a factory of ghosts. Sometimes, when he walked past the shrine, he could still hear the faint echo of their voices. Tenno Heika Banzai, the chaplain, visited him once, bringing tea. They sat beneath the eaves, watching rain slide down the wooden posts. "You think the gods saved you?" the chaplain said softly. Ogawa stared into the cup. "I don't know what to think." The chaplain nodded slowly. "There is a verse in the Manyoshu," he said. "Even when duty demands death, the heart may yet return to life." He looked up. "Be careful, Ogawa. There are men who will not forgive a living ghost." By early May, American bombers began striking airfields across Kyushu. Kanoya was hit twice in 1 week. The barracks were flattened. Pilots ran for cover as hangars erupted in flames. Ogawa helped drag the wounded to the hills beyond the base. Among them was Lieutenant Matsuo, the same intelligence officer who had interrogated him weeks before. His leg was shattered, his uniform soaked in blood. When Ogawa carried him into the shelter, Matsuo grabbed his sleeve. "You should have died," he hissed. Ogawa met his gaze calmly. "Maybe I will tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. When the smoke cleared, the airfield was a wasteland of twisted steel and craters. The last operational planes were sent north to Kagoshima. Ogawa was reassigned to the supply depot, a quiet demotion, far from combat, far from honor. At night, he could see the sky over Okinawa glowing faintly, the reflection of endless fire. He thought often of the others, the ones who had not returned. He imagined their final moments, though the roar, the light, the silence that followed. Sometimes in his dreams he saw their faces rising out of the sea, eyes open, mouths moving, saying something he could never hear. He began writing again. Not reports, not letters, why, just fragments, thoughts, prayers, doubts. They told us the soul lives forever, but the body burns fast. If dying is divine, why does the earth keep turning? The wind that carried me home, was it mercy or punishment? Each line went into the same notebook that held his secret letter. He hid it beneath the floorboards. He didn't know that years later, when Allied investigators combed through the ruins of Kanoya, they would find that notebook still intact, sealed by mud and ash. They would read those words and sit in silence. By June, Japan was unraveling. The radio played only marches and propaganda now. Tokyo was in ruins. The emperor's voice, the one the pilots had sworn to die for, had not been heard in months. One evening, as Ogawa was repairing a fuel line, he looked up and saw a strange glow above the mountains. It wasn't fire, and it was auroral, ghostly, faintly green. The men around him murmured in awe. "The spirits of the fallen," someone whispered. Ogawa watched until it faded, feeling a strange calm settle over him. That night, he wrote one final entry before closing his notebook for good. "The gods do not demand death. They only ask that we remember what we saw before the fire." He did not know that far away on the other side of the world, another kind of fire was being prepared. One that would burn brighter than any seen before. One that would end the war and make every word he wrote both obsolete and eternal. August 15, 1945. At precisely noon, across a shattered empire, loudspeakers crackled to life. The air hung still, heavy with heat and disbelief. Soldiers, civilians, children, mothers, all froze where they stood as the voice of Emperor Hirohito, distant and trembling, filled the air for the first time in history. Ogawa stood in the supply yard of what was left of Kanoya Air Base. The sky above him was empty. The hum of cicadas drowned the static for a moment, until the voice broke through, thin and formal, echoing through loudspeakers wired to the chapel roof. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have decided to effect a settlement by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." For a long moment no one moved. Then one man, a mechanic with oil-stained hands, began to laugh. Not from joy, but from something deeper, sharper, almost madness. Others stood with their mouths open, faces pale. One officer drew his sword, staring at it as though it no longer meant anything. A few dropped to their knees, weeping silently. Ogawa didn't move. He only felt the wind shift across the airstrip, soft and warm. It was over. The empire that had demanded his death was gone. The emperor, The living god for whom he had been willing to burn had just surrendered. He walked to the shrine at the end of the runway. The wooden pillars were cracked from shrapnel, the paper lanterns blackened. Inside, the names of the fallen pilots were written on wooden WWII tablets, hundreds of them carved neatly, each representing a boy who had smiled, bowed, and vanished into flame. He touched one of the tablets. Beneath the soot, he could still read the name Haratakao, his wingman. He whispered, "You did what they asked." And still, they lost. Then slowly he knelt. He didn't cry. He just sat in silence as the air vibrated with something beyond words. Grief, confusion, disbelief. The sound of the Emperor's voice faded into static. When the broadcast ended, the country changed forever. In the days that followed, order collapsed. Commanders burned documents. Soldiers discarded uniforms. Civilians tore down flags. The once sacred bases became graveyards of metal and ghosts. Ogawa was ordered to assist with dismantling the airfield. The orders came not from Tokyo, but from the local police, now under Allied oversight. Destroy aircraft. Burn munitions. Leave nothing functional. He did as told. Day after day, he and a handful of surviving mechanics smashed propellers with hammers, drained fuel tanks, and set fire to piles of instruments. It was a strange kind of funeral, one that smelled of gasoline and regret. The Zero that had saved his life was already gone, melted into scrap. But as he watched the others burn, Ogawa felt no anger, only emptiness. The gods had gone quiet. At night, the village near the base flickered with faint candlelight. The soldiers who had once saluted him now begged for rice. The children who had once shouted "Banzai" now whispered when they passed. No one spoke of glory anymore. The word itself had burned away. One evening, a train arrived carrying Allied officers and interpreters. Ogawa stood by as they inspected the field. They moved with a kind of detached curiosity, like men touring ruins. One of them, a tall American with sharp eyes and a southern drawl, stopped at a pile of wrecked planes. "These are the Kamikazes?" he asked through an interpreter. "Yes," came the answer. The American bent down, brushing soot from a torn piece of fuselage where the red sun still faintly showed. "All this," he murmured, "for nothing." Ogawa turned away. He didn't need a translator to understand. That night, he went back to the barracks, what remained of it. He retrieved the notebook from beneath the floorboards. It was still intact, edges darkened by smoke. He opened to the last page, touched the words he had written weeks before, and added a single line beneath them. "If silence is survival, then I am already dead." Then he closed the book and stepped outside. The sky was filled with stars, clearer than he had ever seen them during the war. For a brief moment he felt weightless, untethered, as if the sky itself were asking him to rise again, not in flame, but in forgiveness. But forgiveness was a word he did not yet understand. When the occupation began in earnest, the Americans took over Kanoya. Trucks rolled in carrying engineers and translators. Signs in English replaced Japanese ones. Pilots were questioned, mechanics reassigned, officers detained. Ogawa was summoned once more, this time by a man in a khaki uniform with a white armband marked GHQ. His interpreter, a young woman from Tokyo, spoke softly but firmly. "They would like to ask about your mission." He nodded. The American officer adjusted his cap. "You were a kamikaze, yes?" "Yes, but you lived." "Yes." The man studied him. "Why?" Ogawa hesitated. "Because I missed." The officer smiled faintly. "Everyone misses sometimes." Ogawa didn't reply. "Do you remember what ship you were targeting?" "The carrier line. I think the Bunker Hill." The officer exchanged a glance with his aide. "That ship was hit weeks later by another kamikaze," he said quietly. "Over 390 men died." Ogawa looked down at his hands. "Then perhaps the gods waited." The interpreter faltered on the translation, glancing at him with uncertainty. The officer leaned back. "The gods waited?" Ogawa nodded. "For us to learn." There was no further questioning. The Americans thanked him, made notes, and left. But as the months passed, their curiosity turned into something else. Investigation. They combed through the ruins of airfields, through bunkers and records, trying to understand the mind of the Toko. To them it was madness. Weaponized faith, a culture that turned death into strategy. But when they found Ogawa's sealed envelope, the one marked to be opened after victory, the tone changed. They expected a confession, an oath, a declaration of loyalty. Instead, they found the single line that no translator could quite explain. The gods did not want me to die today. For weeks, they debated its meaning. Some said it was defiance. Others called it mysticism. One interpreter, a professor from Kyoto University, told them quietly, "It means he believed something greater than war decided his fate." To the Americans, that was more unsettling than fanaticism. It was humanity. By the time winter came, Ogawa had been relocated to Kagoshima, working as a dockhand. The war had stripped him of uniform, rank, and purpose. He was just another man trying to rebuild a life that no longer existed. Sometimes when ships came in, he saw American sailors on deck, laughing, smoking, alive. He wondered if any of them had been on the fleet he saw that morning, if any had looked up and seen his zero diving before it turned away. One evening, he watched the sea as the sun fell. The horizon burned red, the same red that once flew on his wing. He whispered softly, "You spared me." But for what? No answer came. Only the rhythm of the waves. In 1946, when GHQ investigators published their internal report on Japan's special attack psychology, one paragraph stood out, a note from a Captain James P. Lawrence, who had interviewed Ogawa personally. Contrary to our expectations, not all kamikaze were ideologically extreme. One survivor displayed neither hatred nor zeal, only exhaustion. He spoke of the wind as if it were alive, as if mercy itself had reached out to stop his fall. His words, "The gods did not want me to die today," may one day say more about humanity than about war. Ogawa never saw that report. He lived quietly for years, in a small wooden house near the coast. He never married. Neighbors said he spent his evenings staring out to sea, as if waiting for something to rise again. When he died in 1962, his notebook was still on his bedside table, open to that same final line. The wind returned to Kanoya 20 years too late. It came not as the divine gale of myth or the storm of engines, but as a soft spring current blowing through an airfield reborn. The year was 1965. Children now played on the same concrete where men once died for an emperor who had fallen silent. At the edge of the runway, among weeds and cracked foundations, stood a memorial, a low stone slab engraved with the names of the Tokotai. The 201st Air Group's insignia was carved into it, weathered smooth by rain. In the village beyond the field, an old woman in a plain kimono waited for the bus. Her name was Yuki Ogawa, Kiyoshi's sister. She carried a parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside were the few things left of her brother's life: his photo in uniform, his service medal, and a small notebook with pages yellowed by time. That morning, she had received a letter stamped from the United States Navy Historical Office. The envelope was thin, official, written in English she could not read. A local teacher translated it for her. It said, "To the family of Petty Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa. During the restoration of archival records, our department has reclassified certain materials from the occupation period. Among them was a translated copy of your brother's final note. We wish to return the original document to his surviving kin." Inside the parcel was a sealed envelope, marked in her brother's careful handwriting, "To be opened after victory." She had never known it existed. The teacher translated the note aloud. When she heard the line, "The gods did not want me to die today," she covered her mouth and wept quietly. The teacher said nothing. There was nothing to say. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, post-war scholars were beginning to re-examine the psychology of the kamikaze. The occupation had ended. Japan was rebuilding, thriving. But questions lingered in the collective silence. How could an entire generation be convinced that death was duty? And what did it mean when one man, by fate or mercy, had refused it? At Waseda University, a historian named Professor Takeshi Ishikawa began compiling first-hand accounts from surviving Tokutai members. Most had remained silent for decades, ashamed of surviving what others did not. But when Ishikawa read Ogawa's translated letter, he stopped teaching for a week. He described it later in his journal. "It is not a statement of defiance, nor of devotion. It is something rarer. a moment where duty and soul separate and humanity steps between them. The entire weight of the war can be seen in those 9 words. He requested permission to view the original document. It was brittle, edges darkened by smoke, the kanji faint but clear. The ink bled slightly as if written with a trembling hand. Ishikawa held it under the light and whispered, "You lived because Japan had to remember." He included Ogawa's story in his 1968 anthology Voices of the Vanished. It sold modestly, but in the years that followed, one chapter, "The Pilot Who Returned," spread through universities and newspapers. Veterans who had buried their memories began writing letters to Ishikawa, saying that for the first time, they no longer felt cursed for surviving. Half a world away, in 1971, an American historian named Dr. Ellen Parkhurst, working at the Naval War College, discovered Ogawa's letter referenced in declassified reports. She tracked down the original copy through the National Archives in Maryland. When she finally held it, thin, fragile, still folded along the same creases made in 1945, she described the experience as like touching the breath of a ghost. In her lectures, she used it not to condemn but to connect. War, she told her students, is fought by men convinced they have no choice. Ogawa's note is proof that even in the machinery of fanaticism, conscience still flickers. She published an article titled, "The Day the Wind Refused to Blow." It caused controversy. Some veterans called it sentimental, others profound. Yet one photograph in the article, a scanned copy of the original note, framed against the Imperial Navy letterhead, was reprinted in dozens of magazines. The line, "The gods did not want me to die today," became something larger than its author. It became a mirror held up to both sides of the Pacific. In Kagoshima, Yuki Ogawa kept the letter in a wooden box beside the family altar. Every morning, she placed a cup of tea before her brother's photograph. She never spoke of the war again, but sometimes neighbors would find her by the shore staring at the sea. When asked what she thought about her brother's fate, she would simply say, "He was the wind that came home." She died in 1988, leaving the box and the notebook to her grandson, Kenji, then a student at Tokyo University. Curious, he read the old notebook late one night. The ink had faded, but one passage still stood out clearly. "The wind that carried me home, was it mercy or punishment?" Kenji wept quietly. He realized his uncle's war had never truly ended. It had only changed shape. Years later, when he became a documentary filmmaker, he traveled to Kanoya to film the ruins of the old airfield. The hangars were gone, replaced by farmland, but the wind still swept through the tall grass with the same low hum his uncle must have heard 80 years earlier. He placed his camera down beside the memorial stone, recording the sound of the wind for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. When the footage was played at a film festival in Tokyo, the audience sat in silence, as if listening to the ghosts breathe. In 1995, Japan held a commemoration for the 50th anniversary of the war's end. Veterans, civilians, and foreign dignitaries gathered at Yasukuni Shrine. Among them was an American naval officer who approached the display of recovered Kamikaze letters. He paused before one frame, a faded slip of paper, its edges browned with age. Beneath it, a small card read, "Kyoshi Ogawa, 201st Air Group, Kanoya Air Base, April 1945. Recovered by Allied investigators, 1952. Final note, the gods did not want me to die today." The officer removed his cap and stood for a long time. When a journalist asked him later why he lingered, he replied softly, "Because he was my enemy, and yet for a moment he thought like me." Time, the ultimate archivist, continued its quiet work. The physical letter yellowed, the ink almost vanished, yet its words outlived nations' ideologies, even the men who had written their own ends into history. By the turn of the century, Ogawa's name had become part of academic studies, referenced in textbooks and memorials. Some debated whether his story symbolized weakness or enlightenment. Others said it proved that no war, no matter how vast or divine, could extinguish the individual will to live. But in the end, perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps it was a message not from soldier to empire, but from man to eternity, a reminder whispered through the wreckage that life, fragile and reluctant, still resists even the commands of gods. And so the wind keeps blowing through Kanoya, across the rebuilt runways, past the memorial stone where cherry blossoms fall each spring. The blossoms land softly on the engraved names, on Haratakao, on Fujita, and on Kiyoshi Ogawa. When the petals scatter again into the air, they rise as if carried by a force unseen, circling once above the field before disappearing into the endless blue. For a moment, it feels as though the wind itself remembers,